Hey everyone, it's me again. Pull up a chair and grab whatever you drink while you listen. Could be a coffee, a beer, something stronger if the day called for it. Let's hang out for a bit. The light's low, the dog's settled at my feet, and somewhere down the hall I can hear the ordinary sounds of a house still being lived in. And that's a feeling we'll come back to tonight because it matters more than it should. But for now, just hello. Before we go anywhere tonight, or today, depending on when you're listening, again, I want to say thank you. So everybody who sent notes about what I'm doing here or trying to do here, and there's actually more of you than I initially thought, so I do appreciate it. And bearing with me again. Seems like I'm always apologizing, but it's an indulgence, and I appreciate you indulging me as well. So hopefully you get something out of this as well. I just want to say thanks again to everybody, my friends that I'm sending out like a bit of a trial balloon so that we get a sense of the tone and the topics and the structure and the format and all that stuff. Getting that feedback is really, really important. So again, it's super appreciated. And I've also had some technical help with some folks as well. I hope that the quality improves. I do have a new mic, so hopefully that makes a bit of a difference. Actually, I used it. I can remember what the first one was. It was definitely used on the last episode. It's a little bit higher end, the other one. The other one was pretty good, but anyways. So again, thank you. And as always, this one is for her, the woman this entire podcast is dedicated to, and the one who tolerates the late night rabbit holes. I do have stacks of horror books that slowly colonize every flat surface in the house. And sometimes the strange music playing in my recording area at hours when sensible people might be wanting to sleep. Anyways, she doesn't always watch the movies with me, and that's fine. She doesn't have to. This one she did. She watched with me on a rewatch. And the dedication really isn't about having shared taste. It's about a life shared. And a love that has somehow withstood my unwavering enthusiasm for things that go bump in the night. My bloody love letter. I'm going to keep these foibles in. So my bloody love letter, this podcast, every episode is to her. Always to her. So welcome to my bloody love letter. A bit of news before we get going. So on the personal side, I've been pretty deep into a few projects, both at work and at home. The day job is obviously a priority for various reasons, including getting paid. It's good. I actually enjoy my work. And I also attempt to play music, so that takes up a little bit of my time as well. It doesn't really leave a lot of room for watching as many movies as I'd like to, but what I will say is I've tried to streamline some of the processes I'm doing for this. This is all sort of self-contained. I'm doing this myself, from recording to editing to putting this out to the website. That's not to say like poor me. It's just it takes time. So, but the cadence should pick up. I'm hoping to keep this thing going. I know we're in the top 10 of this list of the 80s. My influential top 20 80s horror films. And I haven't really reviewed the rules of this, the criteria. So I'll just quickly go through that and then we'll move forward. Hopefully I'm not dragging this out. I feel like I am. Sorry, I apologize. If I'm dragging it out, I apologize. But so the criteria is, number one, obviously it had to be made and released in the 80s, I guess. That's if there's like something that was made in 79 and released in 1980, that counts. So the number two item is it can't be, if it's part of a series, you can only have one selection from that series. So this includes franchises like Friday the 13th, Halloween, and so on. So, and the third is a director. There could only be one director per film. So, or sorry, one director on this list. So if I selected, like I've selected David Cronenberg already, one of his films earlier, I can't put another Cronenberg, even though I could put a number of his films on this list, especially from the 80s. So that's the criteria. And it's just to keep it interesting and diverse, or a little bit more diverse than sort of flooding it with a bunch of John Carpenter and David Cronenberg and anybody else who comes to mind, Wes Craven. So that is that. Let's go back a little bit. Way back, obviously, the 80s. I want to take you back to a time in my life in 1981 in the winter. I'm going to date myself, but I was about 11 years old. We had bought a Fisher VHS player and we had it in the living room, and that was a pretty big deal at the time. It was a status object. I'm not going to lie, it changed my life, as I'm sure it changed a lot of people's lives, introducing something like this into their living room. So in this situation, in the living room, in the winter of 1981, an image comes on watching a movie, a house. It's not a monster. It's not a killer. It's just a house. And then something inside me, something I didn't have words for at that time, something kind of dropped. The dread just, it didn't build, but it arrived fully formed just on the opening shots. By the end of the film, I wasn't sure what I was feeling, but it was a bit hollowed out, I guess. I'm trying to think of a better way of describing that feeling. I didn't cry or anything like that. I didn't really say anything, and I went to bed that night with the hallway light on, and my bedroom door cracked open just enough to hear activity from the family in the kitchen, doing whatever, dishes or things like that. The ordinary sounds, of a house that was still mine. And it was something I needed. I needed that perimeter. I needed the proof that the world I lived in was still populated by the living. I didn't have the language for it then, as I said. I just knew something had shifted. A door had opened in me, and what walked through it was something that didn't leave, stayed with me. That night was the beginning of something I've spent my entire life trying to understand. It wasn't the first horror movie I'd seen, but it was in many ways the first one that left something new in feeling about watching horror. So let's talk about it. So we're now at number 9 on this list. And yeah, these ones are obviously closer to me, more intimate to me. And thinking about how I want to talk about them, is, I'm trying to put the more personal aspect of it because, there's a lot of films that definitely I absolutely adore. The ones that really stay with me. I'm trying to understand why. So these films didn't just sort of shape me. They kind of reshaped me. And each one of the films that are on this list have earned this spot. This one earned it kind of the hard way by sitting in me and my psyche for 45 plus years, roughly. And it didn't fade. Some films you outgrow and some films you revisit. Some make a bigger impact. This one was one that it really, I don't know, got under my skin. I guess that's a phrase that gets used quite a bit. But it did get under my skin. So this was dread in the form of architecture. A house that could break your heart. This is a film. It came out in 1980. It was directed by Peter Medak. And it starred icon George C. Scott and another icon in Melvyn Douglas. And if you haven't figured it out yet, we're talking about The Changeling.
Within this old house live two residents. One of them is John Russell, composer, professor. The other has been dead for over 70 years.
Claire, I'd like to talk to you about the house.
Did you die in this house? How did you die?
Whatever it is trying desperately to communicate. What is it in that house, Claire? What is it doing? Why is it trying to reach me? It's a hand. Senator, I'm John Russell. I'm living in your house. Senator, look, I want to show him that. You've got something of the senator's. He wants it back.
John?
What is it you want? What do you want from me?
Many films will frighten you, but only a few can really terrify you. The Changeling, an experience beyond total fear.
Before we get into the production and the era, the music, all of it, I want to lay out the argument I'm going to attempt to build throughout this conversation. Because every section of this episode is going to fold back into the idea that I'm going to propose. The Changeling is not a haunted house film. So I'm going to say that again because the framing of it has been wrong for me anyways, for 45 years. And it matters. It's not a haunted house film. It's a film about grief as perception. The idea, and this is sort of the radical element that the film is doing, quietly, it's the idea that devastating loss tunes you to a frequency other people cannot hear. Joseph Carmichael, the dead child, doesn't possess that house in any conventional supernatural sense. He's been there for decades, screaming into a void no one has tuned in to receive. The house didn't pick John Russell. John Russell earned access to it. He arrived already broken. He arrived already fluent in the language of suffering because he had just lost his own wife and daughter in front of his own eyes. The film says, and this is the part that kind of hit me a little deeper, is that only the wounded can hear the wounded. And underneath that, deeper, there's an even more devastating argument that few films that make it directly, or at least this quietly. The Changeling is making a moral claim about the world. It says that human cruelty leaves a permanent stain, that a child murdered for money and buried in a well doesn't simply disappear because the people responsible were powerful enough to make the records vanish. The wound stays. The wound waits. And only those already marked by loss can perceive it clearly enough to demand justice. That's not a ghost story. That's a theology. And we're going to spend the rest of this episode unpacking how a little Canadian independent film made for a few $1 million on a tax shelter managed to land an argument that big. To understand what this film is doing, you have to understand what 1980 actually felt like. Not the version of 1980 that pop culture has packaged for us in the years since. The neon Reagan? Have we ever landed on how we actually say his name? Anyways, the neon Reagan era 80s. The mall culture, the synth pop optimism. That's a slightly later construction. 1980 itself is kind of a hinge year. It is still in the 70s, really, in mood. Carter is on his way out. Reagan is on his way in. Watergate is still pretty recent. Vietnam is also recent. The Iran hostage crisis is unfolding in real time and every night on the news. And for a kid my age, at the age of 11, plugged into the family TV, I was already paying attention more than the adults realized. The dominant emotional texture of that moment wasn't political in any specific sense. It was just something much simpler and more corrosive. It was the dawning awareness that the adult world was complicated, that institutional power didn't always tell the truth, and that bad people sometimes simply got away with things. Right always didn't triumph over evil. That was a tough lesson. But it was the lesson that the news was teaching, even if no one was sitting us down to teach it. The Changeling lands inside that mood with surgical precision. Its core wound, a child murdered, the murder covered up by a powerful family, the truth buried for decades, is not actually a supernatural premise. It's a pattern. It's actually the pattern that the post-Watergate generation was being taught to recognize. The horror of the film on its deepest level isn't that ghosts are real. The horror is that the cover-up worked. For 60-some years, it worked. The institution won. And a child screamed in a well that nobody was listening to. So watching it at 11, I couldn't have really articulated any of that. But I could feel it. The dread of the film was not just architectural, as mentioned before. It was civic. It said something true about the world the adults had built.
It took only 18 months to build, and so by the 1910 they were living in here.
It's an iconic building, one with a lot of history, a military background, and now a world-renowned educational institution.
About 40 rooms, 22 bedrooms, numerous bathrooms and all that. We have the beautiful stone fireplaces as well as a number of different kinds of wood.
Hatley Castle was built by James Dunsmuir, a man with many titles who came from money. Coal Baron, Premier of British Columbia, and Lieutenant Governor of the province.
It was very important to him to make sure that he was able to enjoy both the hunting that he was able to do here, and his wife Laura wanted to have a place where she could continue to entertain in a grand style.
With 8 daughters and 2 sons, this place was more than big enough to hold a family, entertain guests, and house servants.
Let's talk about how this film came into being, because the production story explains an enormous amount of what ends up on screen. The Changeling is a Canadian independent production. Excuse me. There's no Hollywood studio involved. There's no studio executive sending notes about how to make this thing more commercial, or make it faster, or make it gorier, make it more in line with what was selling tickets in 1980. And that alone, that whole absence of that kind of pressure, explains the film's restraint. Now, I had previously had that financing story a little wrong, and so let's correct it on record, because the actual truth is more interesting than the version I've been carrying. The film was not strictly funded by a Canadian government film grant. It was a tax shelter production, financed under a capital cost allowance scheme, and that allowed investors to deduct 100% of their investment in certified Canadian feature films from their taxable income. The production company was called Chessman Park Productions, and the budget came in around $6.6 million. The film went on to actually earn roughly $12 million at the box office. So the money came from private investors, and they were chasing a tax incentive, and it wasn't any kind of government cultural fund. And that detail matters because it means the people writing the checks weren't trying to make art, and they weren't trying to make a hit either. They're just simply using it as an income tax shelter, which meant that the filmmakers had something rare and precious, really. It was capital with no creative agenda attached to it. And so what do you do with that kind of freedom? So what this team did was make the least exploitative, least trend-chasing horror film of its year. They shot largely on real heritage locations in Vancouver and on Vancouver Island, including Hatley Castle. And the difference between real locations and constructed sets is a difference you can feel in your bones. Real places carry history. They carry the residue of every life that has moved through them. A purpose-built haunted house set, no matter how well designed, is always going to feel slightly aware of itself and slightly artificial. Hatley Castle was not aware of itself. It just stood there. It was full of its own ghosts. It just so happened there happened to be a camera there catching them. So, Peter Medak directed this film. He was previously best known film was in 1972, a film called The Ruling Class, starring Peter O'Toole. And I want to spend a little time on him because his career is sort of interesting, but it's interesting in the sense that it's, I guess, frustrating, at least as far as horror goes. The Changeling is, in my honest assessment, the best thing he ever made, including The Ruling Class. And it would be essential viewing regardless of who had directed it. That's how strong the work is. But Medak was not and never became a horror director by training or identity or temperament. He came up through British television and theatrical work. His instincts were rooted in character and story and slow buildup of atmosphere. He wasn't really chasing genre. So this outsider perspective is probably why, partially anyways, why this film works. This was someone who came up inside the horror genre in 1980. Sorry, this is my perspective. Someone who came up in the horror genre in 1980 as a youngin' would have been steeped in the rhythms of the slasher and the shock cuts of post-Halloween filmmaking, in the gore escalations of Italian giallo, which really didn't come to me until later, but let's just say for argument's sake, I was aware of its presence. and also the giallo sort of American imitators. Medak didn't have those instincts. He had storytelling instincts. He approached the material the way you'd approach a serious drama with a ghost in it. And that's what The Changeling actually is. It's a serious drama that has a ghost in it. The horror is in service of character. It's never the other way around. The frustrating part, genuinely frustrating part, if you love this film, is that Medak never returned to this register. He worked steadily for decades afterwards, including, he did go into the genre one more time with the sequel to the movie Species, but not really. He never really made another film that operated at that frequency that The Changeling operated on. So we got one of those, and I'm grateful for that. But that's a loss for the genre, and I think it's also a loss for Medak, because I think this is the kind of material his sensibility was built for, and he just never found the right material twice. The film's original fan base was small, and it did okay at the box office, and it actually won awards in Canada. But it didn't enter the cultural bloodstream the way The Shining did the same year. Its reputation has been built almost entirely through time and critical reappraisal, word of mouth, tape passed between people, late night television rediscoveries. The film history had to catch up to all of this. And I'd argue that the canonization process is still ongoing to this day. Every year, more people find this film and recognize what it is.
Be seated. I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country.
You can't talk about this film without talking about the casting, because the casting is in itself an argument. George C. Scott plays John Russell. George C. Scott, the man was Patton. He had turned down an Oscar. He was prestige. He had gravitas as an actor in the most old school sense of that word. And his presence at the top of the call sheet for a 1980 horror film, well, that was kind of a signal flare. It announced before a single frame played that this film was playing a different game than its contemporaries. This was not a film looking to be lumped in with the slasher boom. Scott's involvement meant adults were in the room and that they could take it seriously. And for the most part, adults did. What Scott actually does in his performance is more remarkable than any prestige he brings to it. He plays grief as a quiet, steady, and almost analytical state. John Russell's not a man just falling apart. He's a man who has been broken so completely that he no longer has the energy for hysteria. His grief and his obsession with the mystery of the house are not two things. They're the same thing. He follows the ghost because following the ghost is the only way left to feel anything. Scott never overplays it. He never weeps to the camera. He never breaks. He simply walks deeper into the dark with a kind of calm that only comes from someone who has already lost everything and everything that could have been lost. So you also have Melvyn Douglas. He plays Senator Carmichael. And if we're being honest, he's also one of the tragedies in this film. Douglas doesn't play a villain. He just plays a man who has inhabited a constructed identity for so long that he's become it. The original sin, the murder he was substituted for as a child. And this fortune built on a dead boy's bones is buried so deep inside him that confronting it would mean a complete collapse of his selfhood, of his world. He's not evil in the cackling sense, no mustache twirling. He's something worse. He's a man who cannot afford to know what he is. And Douglas, who was a legend by this point, plays every scene with this enormous reservoir of weight and weariness that was hiding underneath it. You watch him and you understand that this is the deepest horror that the film actually has. It's not the ghost. It's this man. So you had two heavyweight actors, two men undone by what they carry. One by grief he can't escape, and the other by guilt he cannot afford to acknowledge. And those two components, they kind of define the spine of this film. In terms of production difficulties, the historical record doesn't really show any major on-set crisis. There were no things like fires or walk-offs, no mid-production catastrophe. But there is, I think, a genuinely fascinating wrinkle, anyways, that I think gets at something important about the film. And it's about who almost directed it. Donald Cammell, the British filmmaker, the man behind Performance, was a genuinely uncategorizable artist. He was initially attached to direct The Changeling. He eventually left over creative differences with the producers. Peter Medak was, in fact, the third director attached to the project. So you had three directors before you had the right one. And the detail I love most about Medak's eventual arrival is something he said in a 2018 interview when he looked back at the first reading of the script. His words, which I'm just going to paraphrase, was that the script petrified him. That was his reaction. Fear. The script scared him before it became his job to film it. So that really is, to me, the production story. It wasn't a crisis, but it was a casting call for the right sensibility. This was a project that needed a director who came to it out of genuine fear rather than as an assignment. The first two directors couldn't crack it, or didn't see it, or didn't agree with the producers about what the film wanted to be. Medak read it and was scared by it. That's the difference. You can feel it in the final film. Every frame is shot by someone who knew in their gut that the material was dangerous and worth treating seriously. And I guess one more production detail that is worth flagging. Principal photography ran from December of 78 until February of 1979. The film didn't release until March of 1980. So it's over a year in post-production, which is a long runway by any standard, and especially long for an independent film of that era. Something significant happened in post. Something like sound design or score, editing, picture lock, that the team took their time on. And it shows. The sound design alone in The Changeling is one of the great quiet achievements of this film. They didn't rush it. They got it. And now we get to the story behind the story, which is one of the more genuinely strange and, well, quite honestly, unverifiable, but it's an irresistible legend of this film. The screenwriter on this film was a man named Russell Hunter, whose actually his real name was Russell Ellis. He claimed that the events of The Changeling were based on his own real experiences in a Denver mansion in the late 1960s. And by his account and in his telling, it went like this. He moved into a place called the Henry Treat Rogers Mansion on the edge of Chesapeake Park in Denver, 1968. He started hearing repeated bouncing sounds coming from what he thought was the attic. He was an architect. He and an architect friend eventually located a sealed over door in the back of an upstairs closet that led to a solitary hidden room. When they finally cracked the door open, a red rubber ball came down the steps, one bounce at a time, and then just vanished. According to Hunter, this happened twice before he decided he had to investigate the hidden room further. That's the story. That's the seed of this film. Now, here's a little nuance. The Denver Public Library has dug into the account over the years, and, well, the awkward truth is they can't find concrete records that Hunter actually lived in the Henry Treat Rogers Mansion, although he did reside in Denver at the end of the 1960s. So his account can't be fully verified, and hopefully this is the part that keeps the story alive, it also can't be fully debunked. There are enough strange details surrounding it to keep the curious. Among them, the family who built the mansion owned farmland in roughly the area where the child's unmarked grave was said to be located. And here's some haunting contextual detail. The land around Chesapeake Park was originally a cemetery. The exhumation process, when the area was being repurposed, this whole process of digging up and relocating the dead, it left, by some estimates, between 2,000 and 5,000 bodies still in the ground, still there, underneath the park where people walk their dogs. Unsettling. Whether you believe Hunter's account or not is almost beside the point. What matters is that he believed it, or he believed enough of it anyways. That conviction transferred from him to the page, from the page to the filmmakers, from the filmmakers to every department on the production. You can feel the seriousness of belief in every frame of the film. It is shot by people who are not winking at the audience. They're not making fun haunted house romp. They are making a film that they, on some level, are afraid is true. That's a difference. And that's why it lands.
The Watergate crisis was closing in on Richard Nixon. The public mood turned against him when he tried to kill off the Watergate investigation and sacked the special prosecutor in charge of the case. Now he was threatened with impeachment. For the first time in 100 years, a serious demand to strip the president of office hit Congress.
So let's step back out and talk about the broader cultural moment, because the Changeling did not arrive in a vacuum, and the air it landed in was part of what gave its weight. I touched on this earlier. 1980 was a hinge year. The Carter to Reagan transition, the lingering shadows of Watergate and Vietnam. But I want to go a little deeper on what that actually felt like as a kid. You have to understand, and this is something I think that gets a little flattened through the lens of nostalgia, that the 1970s had been brutal, at least in the American sense of itself. The cover-ups, the lies that turned out to be true, the slow public realization that the people in charge had been lying about the war for the better part of a decade. By 1980, even a 11-year-old kid in Canada was picking up the residue of that. We watched the American news. We absorbed American culture. And the dominant adult mood was kind of low-grade cynicism that had not been there in earlier eras. The idea that institutions could be trusted, well, had been quietly punctured. The Changeling reflects that. The horror at its center is institutional. It's not some random act of evil. It's about a powerful family with money and connections who killed a child, hid the body, swapped in a substitute, and they rode out that lie into a Senate seat for the next 60 years. That's not some old Gothic horror. That's a metaphor for any reader of the morning paper in 1980, and they would have recognized that immediately. The supernatural element is the vehicle. The actual horror is that this kind of cover-up was familiar. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. And for a kid watching this in 1981, you didn't need to articulate any of that to really feel it. That's the thing about dread. It's in the atmosphere. But its atmospheric pressure was political. It was the texture of growing up in a world where the adults you trusted were starting to sound less certain than they used to.
Did you know that a young boy drowned the year before those two others were killed? The counselors weren't paying any attention. They were making love while that young boy drowned. His name was Jason.
So let's talk about where this film sits in the horror landscape of its moment. Because The Changeling is really playing a different game than almost everything around it. The reference point, really, the gateway for kids my age was Halloween by John Carpenter, 1978. That was the moment, in my opinion, that horror revealed itself to a whole new generation as something that could produce genuine fear and genuine attraction at the same time. The slasher wave that followed Halloween was immediate and in large volumes and aimed squarely at teenagers. Friday the 13th landed the same year as The Changeling, as did Prom Night and Terror Train. The slasher template is being mass-produced. But here's the thing about being a youngin', again, in the moment. Supernatural horror film often reached kids like me first, before the slashers did. And it was precisely because parents and the broader culture deemed it slightly safer to a degree. There wasn't really as much blood. It was usually less transgressive. A ghost story felt like something you could let an 11-year-old watch in a way that was less, it wasn't, I fumble my words, but it wasn't something that the latest sort of stab and scream entry did not. My generation's introduction to horror was often through supernatural films. I said at the very beginning of this podcast series that at least one of my first memories, the one that made me realize horror was a thing, was the House on Haunted Hill with Vincent Price. And it was the way we picked it up. It was this dread that we felt. Again, the atmosphere. I think it was, in my opinion, again, just my opinion, I'd argue that that's deeper and has more lasting impact than anything that the slasher had to offer. A slasher gives you a guy with a knife, and you can imagine outrunning him, and you can imagine outsmarting him. The threat has a body, whether it's Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees. It has a location, has a weakness. Supernatural horror gives you nothing to fight. You can't outrun a ghost. It's a big metaphor, I guess. You can't outsmart a haunting. The forces are unreasonable, undefeatable, and frequently impossible to fully grasp or perceive. That kind of fear is harder to shake. The Changeling is almost a thesis statement for this entire mode of horror. There is no gore. There is no monster in any conventional sense. The film's most terrifying moments are a wheelchair or a ball, water on the floor, a child's voice on a tape. And all of that, the sum of the parts, it's devastating. It arrived in 1980 alongside The Shining and Friday the 13th. And it was playing an entirely different and quieter, more interior game than either of them. The Shining is obviously more famous and arguably a louder film. Friday the 13th was more commercially successful, for whatever that value comes into play. The Changeling is, in my view, the most psychologically precise. It just doesn't shout. It lasted because of this. Let's talk about the film's reception, because the story of how The Changeling found its audience is in its own way part of the story of the film. It was a Canadian independent production, and it won real critical recognition. I mean, it was the Genie Awards, after all. It was the whole apparatus of Canadian film validation. And that film took home Best Picture at the inaugural Genie Awards. So take that, Hollywood. That's a significant cultural honor. And the box office numbers were respectable. It was $12 million on a $6.6 million budget. It's a real return. And again, to a kid in 1981, none of that really registered. It was Canadian cultural clout, rather, did not penetrate suburban living rooms. The awards ceremonies for Canadian films were not part of that conversation for an 11-year-old. It didn't really matter. The Changeling did not arrive through marketing or hype or word of mouth in any organized sense. It arrived for most of us through a VHS tape that a parent rented. Sometimes not even a personal choice. Sometimes just whatever was left on the shelf when they got to the video store. And I want to argue that this is accidental. It was an intimate mode of discovery. It's part of the legacy of this film, and really most of the films on this list. It never had the cultural megaphone of The Shining. It never had the merchandising or the broad audience saturation that films like Poltergeist had later on, 2 years later. What it had was a slow person-to-person, tape-to-tape spread. People who saw it told other people. Tapes were passed around with old recordings. And over the years, decade by decade, it accumulated a reputation that the box office numbers never reflected. And in a way, it suits this film. The Changeling is not a film that announces itself. It's not built to be a hit. It was built up to kind of creep up on you, to find out when you're ready for it. To be the thing that somebody quietly recommends to you when you're already starting to ask questions about horror, especially ghost stories. And that's how it has lived in the culture. One tape at a time, one conversation at a time. And that brings me to the format itself, to VHS. Because the way we encountered horror as kids in the early 80s was inseparable from the physical object that delivered it. I want you to picture, if you didn't live through it, what a video store was actually all about. It had long aisles of these enormous padded clamshell cases. It was each case the size of a small book. Well, actually, in some cases, a pretty large book. You had the cover art on the front, which was usually a painted poster image, more lurid than the film itself. And on the back, you had a synopsis of what the film was going on, or what was going on with the film. Sorry, I can't speak very well. Sometimes you had stills from the movie, and you picked these up, you held them, you studied them, you built an anticipation relationship with the film before a single frame of it had played. And I think this was the case for The Changeling. The original VHS clamshell was a quiet, ominous piece of cover art that didn't oversell what the film actually was. That alone was unusual. Most horror VHS covers were lying to you. They were selling you more of a exploitation version of the film that was more in the marketing than that was actually on the tape. But the deeper thing about VHS horror, and I think this is pretty important, is what it did to the geography of fear. The theater provides a container. You leave your house, you go somewhere, you sit in the dark with a crowd, and then the film ends. You drive home. There's kind of a bracket around that whole experience. You can close the door on it. VHS collapsed that whole bracket entirely. The horror was now in your house. It was on your television, in the living room where normal life happened, where you ate dinner, where your parents read the paper. If you had a dog, that's where he slept or she slept. And then later that night, after the tape ended and got rewound and went back into its overly padded clamshell case, you had to go to bed in that very same house. You had to walk down that same hallway, past the same rooms. The film had somehow contaminated the space. The Changeling is almost uniquely positioned to exploit this. It is a film about a domestic space, a beautiful old house, a music room, a study, a staircase, being contaminated by dread. And you were watching this from inside your own domestic space. The boundary between the film's house and your house got uncomfortably thin. The room where you played by daylight became the room where something got under your skin at night. The film created its own mild but real haunting. And for me, at 11 years old in that living room with that old Fisher player glowing in the dark, it absolutely did.
Will you speak to us? We are here to help you. What is your name? Will you speak to us?
Yes.
What is your name? Are you the child Cora?
I want to spend a few minutes on a single scene because this film rewards close attention, and one sequence in particular is where everything in my experience with it kind of built up. Where it didn't build up, but it revealed itself. I'm talking about this seance scene, and just to set it up, we have John Russell, played by George C. Scott, had been collecting fragments of this haunting. The bouncing ball, the sounds in the attic, the music box, the wheelchair, the discovery of this sealed over room and the small body inside it. He has been doing the work of a researcher, methodically and calmly, though he's someone in his state of grief might do, because the only alternative is just to collapse. So they bring in a medium and they hold a seance. And in a lesser horror film, this is often where things can get a little cheesy, where the lights flicker and the medium goes into this fake-looking trance. So the audience might chuckle at something like that, but Medak doesn't let that happen. The seance is shot with utter sobriety, The medium is professional, almost businesslike. The participants are anxious but composed. And then the contact begins. And what makes this scene one of the great achievements of this film is kind of what makes it untouchable. It more so has to do with the actual recording of the seance. This seance was being captured on audio tape, those old reel-to-reel. And standard practice for paranormal research at the time was using equipment like that. The actual session, as it was happening in the room, was restrained and quiet. But when they play the tape afterwards, when Russell plays this is, to me, the one that sort of really perked my attention. And it stayed with me. When they play the tape back afterwards, you can hear the dead child's voice on the recording. It's clear. And it's audible. It's audible in a way that was not in the actual room as the seance happened. The implication is pretty devastating. The dead boy was always there. He was always speaking. The room was full of his voice. But the human ear in the moment, in the present tense, could not hear him. It took a recording device, a piece of machinery, indifferent and mechanical, to register what the living were filtering out. The grief in the room had cracked open a channel, but the channel was operating below the threshold of conscious perception. Only the tape caught it. That is, it's pretty chilling. The thought that the dead are always there. And that's what really occurred to me, is that whether you're aware of it or not, the dead are always there. The horror is always happening. That wound is permanent. The only question is whether you have been broken enough in this case to hear it. And John Russell has been. So he hears it. And the film becomes about following a voice that has been screaming into nothing for 60 years and is finally being received. Let me come back to the thesis now and push deeper, because I want to make sure it lands, hopefully. Hopefully I can make it land before we close this out. The Changeling is not a haunted house film. It's a film about grief as perception. And the thing that this film is doing, the thing that I think gets missed when people lump it in with The Shining or Poltergeist and the other big haunted house films of the day, is that it relocates the supernatural from being a property of place to being a property of the perceiver. The house isn't haunted in the conventional sense. The house is a site where something terrible happened, and that has been waiting, screaming, for someone capable of hearing it. The haunting is in the receiver, not the transmitter. John Russell does not stumble into this. He earns it. He arrives at that house already gutted. He has watched his wife and daughter die in front of him in the film's prologue. It was a sequence that established that this man's interior architecture has been demolished before the supernatural plot even begins. So by the time he moves into that house, he's been hollowed out. He is fluent in the grammar of loss. He already knows what despair sounds like from the inside. So when the house starts to speak, he is the one person in a long line of inhabitants who can actually hear it. And underneath the perception argument, there's the moral argument that I keep coming back to, because I think it's, well, I guess the message of the film. The Changeling makes a claim about the universe, and it makes it without preaching, without underlining, without giving you a single character who states it out loud. And the claim is this: human cruelty leaves a permanent stain. A child murdered for money does not simply disappear because the people responsible were powerful enough to make the records vanish. The wound is real. The wound is durable. The wound waits. And it waits specifically for someone broken enough, attentive enough, marked enough by their own loss to perceive it and demand justice. This is not a ghost story. That is a theology. The film is arguing that there is a kind of moral physics at work in the world, that injustice generates a residue that does not dissipate, that simply waits for the right kind of consciousness to come along and recognize it. And the right kind of consciousness in this film's argument is the grieving one. The wounded see the wounded. The dead boy needed someone whose own losses had turned them to his frequency. And John Russell, by terrible coincidence and terrible grace, was that person. That's why this film is on this countdown. That's why it ranks where it ranks. Because where it sits, I felt that it had this pure dread. It was undecoded, and decades later, I can still talk about it without understanding all of what I feel it represents, but I tried my best here. And the feeling about this film has only grown bigger as I've grown older, because every loss I've accumulated since, and we've all accumulated them, hopefully, at least I feel, has made me a slightly better receiver of what this film is actually transmitting. The influence of the Changeling is real, but it's quiet. And it has spread in ways that doesn't always get credited. In my opinion, the most obvious inheritor is a film that it gets most compared to, most often, is the film The Others, Alejandro Amenabar's 2001 film with Nicole Kidman. The DNA is undeniable. A grieving parent, a beautiful old house, restrained supernatural mechanics, a slow accumulation of unease rather than a barrage of shocks. The Others is doing something different in the end, but its tonal palette is almost entirely descended from the Changeling. And I don't think Amenabar would deny that. Quiet horror as a respected mode. That's a lineage you can trace. You can also trace the influence through later, air quote, prestige horror. Films like The Babadook, in some ways, is a Changeling descendant. It was grief literalized into a haunting. The grieving parent as the only person attuned to the threat. The supernatural as the externalization of psychological wounds. You have a film like Hereditary in a darker mode that plays in similar emotional territory. The current wave of so-called elevated horror, and I have my own complicated feelings about that label, it owes a real debt to films like The Changeling. Decades ago, it was a film that it demonstrated that horror could be psychologically serious without sacrificing dread. And another interesting legacy, or part of its legacy to me, is the subterranean one. The Changeling never had a cultural moment. It never had a Friday the 13th franchise tale. It never spawned a cycle of imitators in its immediate wake. Its influence has been more like a slow-acting agent, working on individual filmmakers and serious horror fans one at a time, decade after decade. Mike Flanagan has cited it. Scott Derrickson has also cited it. Plenty of contemporary horror filmmakers point back to this film as a foundational text. And the film itself, as an object, has aged in ways most of its contemporaries have not. Watch most of 1980 horror today, and you can feel that it sort of is dated. You had this fashion and the music cues and the pacing were all reflective of a spot in time. The Changeling does not feel dated. It feels kind of timeless. Not to sound corny. It could have been made yesterday. It could have been made 50 years from now. And that's the durability of restraint. The films that lean harder into the fashions of their moment age faster, way faster. The films that hold themselves back stay young. So 45 plus years on, this film is more respected than it has ever been. The reappraisal is ongoing, and I think we are still, even now, catching up to it. So there you go. This is number 9 on the top 20 list of 1980s films that influenced me. The Changeling. If you've never seen it, please find it. If you've only seen it once, revisit it. If you've seen it 10 times, you already know. It's still finding new floors every time you walk through it. That film is not done with any of us, and that's the gift of films like this. I want to thank you, as always, for spending this time with me. I know how many things compete for your attention, and the fact that you chose this, you chose a quiet hour-ish with an old movie and an older voice, it means a lot to me. So, the countdown continues. We have 8 more to go. Each one is... being honest, this is a hard list to put together. And even with what I felt was the completed list, I was sort of mentally making arguments for other films and their positions. This next film is not an understated movie at all. In fact, it's, when you think of 1980s horror, it's one of the first films you'll think of. I'll leave it at that. But as we move forward and try to wrap up this list, I hope you'll keep walking with me. To my friends and to my family, the people who keep me sharp and keep me honest, I want to thank you. So, and also to my collaborators, named and unnamed, I want to thank you as well. And to the woman this entire project belongs to, my partner, my home, the steady light at the end of every hallway I've ever walked down in the dark. I want to thank you, as always. This one, like every one, is for you. So, thank you. Keep the porch light on. Leave the door cracked open. Remember, I'm just an 11-year-old kid. The dead are talking. You just have to be ready to hear them. This has been my bloody love letter. Good night.